Though the history of ancient Egypt spans more than 3,000 years, some of the most famous rulers come to us from just a few dynasties. From the female king Hatshepsut to the heretic Akhenaten and the great Ramses, the rulers of Egypt's new kingdom were some of the most powerful and interesting pharaohs in history. The new kingdom featured Egypt at the zenith of its power and prestige. Hemmed in between two powerful yet hostile nations, the bringing of the new kingdom must have been a breath of fresh air to native Egyptians. At least, that's what one would expect. However, many Egyptians in Thebes were content with Hyksos rule in the north, as these Asiatic invaders had brought technology such as the wheeled chariot to Egypt. They also opened up the country to Mediterranean commerce and proved themselves adept at administration. But for King Kamosa of Thebes, it was unacceptable for the Nile region to be ruled by anyone but an Egyptian. However, before he could go about reconquering the Nile Delta, it was necessary that he defeat the Kushite Empire to the south, so as not to put himself in a war on two fronts. For the first 2 years of his reign, he prepared for this task ahead. In 1540 BC, he marched south, with the immediate goal of capturing the fortress at Buhen. This fortress was manned by Egyptian soldiers, who had dutifully switched sides when the fortress was conquered by the Nubians. Once again, they swapped sides and welcomed Kamosa as a triumphant general. Though because of the soldiers' wavering loyalties, he set up administration in the region to ensure Egyptian control, appointing his son Teti as viceroy of conquered Nubia. With his southern flank secure, he marched back to Egypt to face the Hyksos. Heading north, he employed psychological warfare to bring his enemies into submission. His army snuck up on the town of Nefrusi, which was governed by an Egyptian named Teti, who had pledged allegiance to the Hyksos. As dawn broke, he stormed the city. After seizing it, he ordered that it be razed to the ground. Teti was killed, and Kamosa also made examples of a few other settlements in the area. The Hyksos ruler Apepi then sent a messenger southward toward Nubia, requesting that they march northward and defeat the Egyptian army. Kamosa captured this messenger and sent him back to the Hyksos capital of Hutwaret with the threatening message.
I will not leave you alone. I will not let you walk the earth without bearing down upon you.
After this, Kamosa attacked the Hyksos capital. Even though this attack was not successful, he returned to Thebes in the likeness of a general at the head of a triumph. The city of Thebes celebrated his apparent victory, but his untimely death a couple of months later forced the Thebans to sit tight and wait for the king's heir to come of age. After a decade of military stalemate, Kamosa's son Ahmosa came of age and resumed his father's work. The Theban navy was sent north to block Hutwaret, pinning them in place while Ahmosa captured the famous city of Memphis, then Ayunu, cult center of the sun god Ra. Ahmosa then marched to the northeastern corner of the delta and took the fort of Jaru. With the Hyksos surrounded, the outcome was never in doubt. Egypt was now restored, but far from secured. To ensure Egypt's future prosperity, Ahmosa went southward and captured the strategically vital island of Sha'at, which lay in the heart of the gold-producing region of Nubia. Egypt was great once more. Ahmosa made a number of religious and administrative reforms, one of which was creating a new position in the priesthood of Amun, the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon. This new position, God's wife of Amun, was then filled by Ahmosa's wife. This gave the royal family direct control in the affairs of the most powerful religious institution in the country. In 1514 BC, Ahmosa died. In only a single reign, the foundations for the great New Kingdom dynasties had been laid. Ahmosa's son and successor, Amenhotep I, solidified once again the concept of divine kingship. His additions to the Theban temple of Apetsut practically turned the city into an open-air temple to himself. The workers that built his tomb were sworn to secrecy, which is why the whereabouts of his mummy are still unknown to this day. Amenhotep was the product of an incestuous marriage, and could have no offspring of his own. Thankfully, late in his reign, he appointed one of his most trusted lieutenants as heir apparent. Thutmose I ascended to the throne, and his first act as pharaoh was issuing decrees proclaiming his coronation in order to cement his legitimacy. The kingdom of Kush had been held at bay since the reign of Kamosa. However, Thutmose I was determined to stamp out what remained south of the Third Cataract. He ordered a flotilla of ships to be hauled over land from the island of Sha'at to the river directly in front of Kerma, the Kushite capital. The onslaught that followed was described in a stela outside the city. There is not a single one of them left. The Nubian bowmen have fallen to the slaughter, and are laid low throughout their lands. The ruler of Kerma was killed in battle, and his body was hung from the bowsprit of one of Thutmose's ships. It was a gruesome display of cruelty and militarism. Egypt was militaristically secure and economically prosperous, but Thutmose I craved the status of a great international power. He knew this couldn't be accomplished in the distant land of Nubia, and so set out to make a show of power in the Near East. The pharaoh sailed up the Phoenician coastline, landing at the friendly harbor of Kebni. The Mitanni Empire had risen in strength over the past few generations, and they were also planning an attack on Egypt's holdings in Syria and Palestine. Thutmose met them in battle, defeating them and taking their chariots and prized horses. After a dozen years on the throne, the great pharaoh died, leaving his people an empire that stretched from the distant Fourth Cataract all the way to Syria. As soon as news of the king's death reached the Nubians, they revolted, killing the Egyptian garrisons in the region and threatening Egyptian hegemony. Thutmose II, the product of one of his father's secondary marriages, rose to power and quickly stamped out the revolt. His wife was the daughter of Thutmose I by his chief consort, so when her husband died after only 3 years on the throne, she pressed her claim. Hatshepsut was technically the regent for her stepson and nephew, Thutmose III, but she made it clear who was really in charge. The ideology of Egyptian divine kingship demanded a male ruler, and the problem of Hatshepsut's gender was never definitively solved, though she did try to make the transition as smooth as possible. She was depicted as a male pharaoh on many monuments, and emphasized her father's achievements to link herself directly to the great pharaoh. In fact, her advisors even invented a new circumlocution to refer to the monarch. The term for the royal house was applied to the ruler. This is where we get our modern word for Egyptian kings, pharaoh. Hatshepsut was certainly a prolific builder. Along with expanding further the Temple of Apetsit in Thebes and erecting the tallest surviving obelisk from ancient Egypt, she expanded and improved temples throughout the entire Nile Valley. Her most famous work is the temple known as Djeser Djeseru, meaning Holy of Holies. The temple included shrines to Hathor, the Egyptian primeval mother goddess, Anubis, the jackal god of mummification, and Ra, the Egyptian sun god. The temple also included chapels where Egyptians could worship Hatshepsut and her father, Thutmose I. This building connected the pharaohs with the most important ancient deities and served to further the monarchy's standing. The grand monument served to mark Hatshepsut's reign as the beginning of a glorious new age. After 15 years as regent, the crown passed to the heir apparent, Thutmose III, who proved himself worthy of his name. The Mitanni Empire had been humbled by Thutmose I, but had recently been stirring up resistance in the Egyptian-occupied towns of Palestine. Immediately after his coronation, Thutmose III set out to humble them once more. Megiddo was his destination, as it commanded important routes through Palestine and was where the Prince of Kadesh was currently located. The pharaoh stopped at the town of Yehem, where he convened a war council. There were 3 main routes to the city of Megiddo, one to the north, one in the center that passed through the town of Aruna, and one to the south. The pharaoh, against his general's advice, decided to march through the center road that passed through the town. Amazingly, they met no resistance. The enemy had fortified the other 2 routes, thinking that the Egyptians wouldn't dare risk the Aruna Pass. Thutmose III set up camp that night on the banks of the Kaina Brook. When dawn broke, the king charged forward at the head of his army in his shining electrum chariot. The enemy crumbled before them, but the Egyptians' discipline broke. The Egyptian soldiers began to plunder the possessions that the enemy had left behind. They now prepared for a long siege. However, they were eventually successful. The Prince of Kadesh eventually crawled on the ground out of the city in submission to the pharaoh. Thutmose III had secured Egyptian control of the region for the next 4 centuries. In another notable military campaign of his, Thutmose III directly emulated his grandfather by sailing to Kebni and then marching across the Euphrates and defeating the Mitanni in battle. Egypt's international reputation was at its zenith. Though many laud Thutmose's successful military campaigns, and rightfully so, the fact that he was able to spend so many years on campaign was as much of a testament to his predecessor's administrative reforms as to his own military prowess. His successor, a second Amenhotep, carried on his father and grandfather's legacy. The new pharaoh was a fit, intelligent youth at his accession, with a particular talent for bowmanship. Amenhotep II could apparently shoot an arrow through a solid copper target while mounted on a chariot. The young pharaoh led 2 major campaigns in the Near East. In the first, he quelled a major uprising in Syria led by 7 princes. They should have learned from recent history. When Amenhotep defeated them, 6 of the princes were hung up on the walls of the Temple of Apetsit as an offering to the gods. The 7th met a similar fate at a temple in Nubia. Amenhotep II was as fierce and uncompromising as his forebears. In his second campaign a couple of years later, the pharaoh crushed an uprising near the town of Megiddo, ordering his army to slay all of the inhabitants of the town as a sign of vengeance. During Amenhotep II's reign, the cult of the sun gained more popularity. Indeed, the pharaoh revered the image of the Great Sphinx, which he believed represented the sun god Horemhakhet. Amenhotep had a temple to the sun god built near the Sphinx, and a stela recording the details of the king's reign erected between the Sphinx's paws. His son and successor, Thutmose IV, shared his father's devotion to Horemhakhet. Thutmose IV spoke of a dream where Horemhakhet promised him a long reign if he would clear the sand away from the body of the Great Sphinx. Thutmose did just that, and built a large wall around the monument. This Thutmose improved diplomatic relations with the Mitanni Empire, which allowed for trade to flourish between the two great powers. To quote Toby Wilkinson's The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, with the country secure in its borders and at peace with its neighbors, and a monarchy resplendent as ever before, the scene was set for an aggrandizement of kingship beyond anything Egypt had seen since the days of the Great Pyramid.